Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of the Think Wildlife podcast. Today we have Bindhu Raghavan. She is the principal scientist of Center of Wildlife Studies and she focuses mostly on wildlife and animal disease ecology and One Health. Welcome Dr. Bindhu and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Anish.
So so let us start by talking about your career in wildlife disease and ecology. So what got you interested in this field and why?
So, when I was a kid, I was always very interested in working with wild animals, and I just wanted to work, be in close proximity to wild animals. But in 1980s in Delhi, when I grew up, the only avenue that was open for that seemed to be, working in a zoo. So I decided to become a vet and work with wildlife in zoos. And then when I had enrolled in the my veterinary course, I discovered the master's course in wildlife biology at the Wildlife Institute of India. And then I decided that okay, I will pursue that to work with wild animals in the wild itself instead of working with wild animals in the zoo. So after my graduation in veterinary science, I worked for about a year and then I appeared for the entrance exam at Wildlife Institute of India and joined the master's course. And then during my master's work, I worked in Ladakh. And after that, for about 10 years, I worked in Ladakh. And during my time there, I was approached by the Department of Wildlife and the Animal Husbandry Department to look into some disease issues in the wild sheep and goat there because I was a vet. And then that started my interest in wildlife diseases and wildlife health, basically.
What are some challenges you faced along the way?
So one of the biggest challenges when I started was that literally nobody in India was looking at wildlife diseases, right? It was still a very nascent field, very young field. In fact, nobody really was interested in it as such. People were mostly doing parasitic diseases or looking at stress as a factor of health, which is still what is going. But there have been no studies in the actual ecology of diseases in wildlife. So I had to try and find PhD positions abroad, and that was quite challenging because finding studentships and fellowships and the right positions abroad. And um, so that was one of the biggest issues that I faced along the way. And the other biggest issue you face when you work with wildlife disease is because for disease studies you have to handle wildlife, okay? And so which in India you don't get permissions for. You, as you might know, it's very difficult to get permissions to tranquilize animals, to dart animals, to collect samples and things like that. So at least in those days. Nowadays there's a lot of trapping happening for radio coloring and other studies, but in those days it was very, very rare, unusual in fact. So yeah.
Currently, what does your research primarily revolve around?
So nowadays, there are two main lines of research that I follow. One is solely related to wildlife diseases and health. And the other is where it intersects with human health and livestock health, which what I like to call as community health, because it's the community of humans, their livestock, and wildlife that live around most of the protected areas. And those studies come under the larger aspect of One Health, the framework of One Health. But we look more into the zoonotic diseases aspect only. And under wildlife diseases and health, I'm more interested in looking at how disease impacts populations of wildlife and how it drives wildlife populations literally, and what is the how disease moves in a population. So those are the main areas of research that I have currently.
So you're also the principal scientist at CWS. Talk about your work there, especially with the wildlife disease and community health program.
Okay, so at CWS, as principal scientist, one of the major duties that I have, of course, is research. Right? But apart from research, there's also the administrative aspect since I am part of the senior leadership. And in that, most of our time goes into raising funds for our projects and making sure our projects on the ground are running smoothly and guiding our junior colleagues and things like that. And in terms of research, like I told you, I already have you know talked about the two main lines of interest in my research. And with that, currently I handle two main projects. One is called the Mudumalai Community Health Project, where we are trying to understand how local people perceive, um, disease in themselves, in livestock and in wildlife, what their attitudes are to these kind of diseases, and how much awareness do they have about zoonotic diseases, and how they perceive themselves when in terms of the biodiversity that they live with. And the second project that I'm involved in is a vulture conservation program in the Nilgiris Biosphere Reserve, where we're trying to look at vulture ecology, and also threats to vulture populations in the region. Apart from all this, I'm also program head for a public health and safety outreach program at CWS known as Wild Suraksha. It's one of our very popular outreach programs started by Dr. Kriti Karand, our executive director. And this program is basically a series of workshops that we conduct with people who live in and around our protected areas in the Western Ghats, and teach them about human wildlife conflict encounters, how to avoid those, what to do when you encounter wildlife, what are zoonotic diseases, and how to avoid those. Basic first aid in case they do have any conflict with wildlife, snake bites, and things like that. So, yeah, this is my main job at CWS.
You mentioned that you are working on vulture ecology. So could you just talk about why vultures are so important for the health of both wildlife and public health?
So I won't say vultures are important to the health of wildlife and public health per se, but vultures they play a very important role, right? I mean, and in school, all of us have studied about the food web and the trophic, cascade. And we know that scavengers play a very important role in that trophic cascade, in that food web, just as carnivores and herbivores do, right? And scavengers, their main role in that entire cascade is to make sure that organic nutrients, especially carbon, is recycled back into the environment, right? When animals die, or all of that matter is converted back into energy that goes back into the environment and is recycled as nutrients for other purposes. And vultures especially are very important because they literally pick a carcass clean down to the bone and sometimes even utilize the bones. So that kind of a very complete cleaning service, so to say, is not provided by many other scavengers, right? So it takes a whole community of scavengers to actually break down a carcass, whereas with vultures, just a group of vultures can do that within hours. And thirdly, vultures have this amazing metabolism where they are able to, I would like to say, inactivate in so to say, many of the pathogens that are found in these carcasses. So for example, if a carcass is of a diseased animal and vultures are eating that carcass, they are able to somehow, the digestive system allows them to literally kill or inactivate the pathogens that are found in that diseased carcass. And so that pathogen is now removed from the environment and they leave the environment clean. So they play a big role in pathogen removal from the environment, and thus they play a big role in keeping our environment clean, our forests clean for both humans and wildlife. So that is one of the most important roles.
So India has lost about 95% of her vulture population since 1990s. So what caused this decimation, and what have been the ecological implications of this?
Right. So one of the most important or biggest cause for vulture declines in India and across Southeast Asia, actually, and also in Africa, was the use of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs in veterinary practice, especially. These include diclofenac, which is the most popular non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, or NSAID as we call them. And this drug is very commonly used by most veterinarians, or was very commonly used by most veterinarians to treat, pain and any kind of disease in animals. So it is a kind of an antipyretic and anti-inflammatory that they were using. So if an animal is sick, the first injection that they'll give is diclofenac. And it's really a wonder drug because it makes the animal feel good within a few hours. and it looks like a kind of a magic bullet. But the problem with that drug is that it does get removed from the system very quickly in animals, but it's mostly used a lot in animals that are literally on the last leg, as a last ditch effort to keep the animal alive. And when the animal dies, it is not able to the diclofenac is not able to get out of the system, so the carcass literally has diclofenac in it. And then when the vultures were eating this carcass, this diclofenac would get into their systems. And diclofenac causes a condition called gout in the vultures, where they were literally forming crystals in the kidneys in the vultures, and this was blocking their urinary and the excretory system, and this was causing a lot of metabolic issues within the vultures, leading to their death. And this death would happen very quickly. It didn't take very long for the diclofenac to get built up into their systems, and that led to this very drastic decline over less than a decade in India and across Southeast Asia. So that was one of the major causes. Of course, in certain pockets, there are other causes also, like power lines or wind turbines, or getting poisoned by people who don't want vultures around their fields. Farmers who sometimes put out poisoned carcasses, so to avoid vultures coming to their area and things like that. But those are much smaller causes for vulture declines compared to diclofenac. And now populations across most of India have crashed, of course. The government had put a ban on the veterinary use of diclofenac in 2006. So after that, diclofenac use has come down, but it's still very much utilized. And then there are other NSAIDs like nimacilides and some ibuprofen and other drugs that also do the same damage to vultures. And so it has been very difficult to get people to understand that maybe not use any of these drugs. There are certain safe drugs such as meloxicam that people can use, and getting veterinarians and getting people in the field to change their habits has been the challenge. Diclofenac and NSAIDs are also typically very cheap and easy to get. So a lot of non-veterinarians, people who are, so to say, quacks in the field, do use that a lot to get these immediate magic bullet results, and that is still leading to vulture deaths across India.
Related to the vulture crisis is the feral dog menace. So, could you just explain why feral dogs are so related to the vulture crisis? Is the menace of feral dogs? So, could you just explain how that is really how feral dogs are a threat to not only wildlife but wildlife health as well?
Yes. So one of the fallouts of the vulture declines was that because now they, as the top scavengers, were removed from the system, these other smaller scavengers such as black kites and feral dogs started now scavenging on these carcasses and scavenging on what normally vultures would have removed from the ecosystem. And that led to an explosion of population in the black kites and wild pigs and feral dogs in many areas. Apart from this, feral dog populations have anyways been increasing a lot because of our increasing populations, especially in peri-urban areas, where we have been dumping our garbage and our household wastes outside in the outskirts of peri-urban areas, and dogs have just been scavenging there and increasing in their populations. So that has also led to increase in feral dog populations. And the problem when that happens next to protected areas or areas where wildlife lives is that these feral dogs, obviously they are carnivores, and they start then attacking or predating on wildlife, including fawns of cheetal and smaller animals. And so that has really not just harmed the wildlife per se, their prey, but also the wild carnivores who were dependent on these prey. So that's literally in direct competition with the wild carnivores. Apart from that, their very presence in these areas is a deterrent for other wild carnivores, okay, because dogs literally roam in packs, and that makes the wild carnivores stay away. So that again impacts wild carnivores and their predation on wildlife. Thirdly, wild dogs, because they interact with both humans and other domestic animals, and they interact with wildlife, they are great carriers for diseases between these two groups. So typically diseases, that might be found in humans and the domestic animals would not find a way to go into wildlife because they live in different areas. But because dogs are these, perfect movement corridors between human areas and wildlife areas. So they act potentially as great carriers for these diseases, uh, and potentially also zoonotic diseases. And so that is a threat again to wildlife health as well as to wildlife populations. So feral dogs, most feral dogs in India are known to be carriers of rabies, as are all warm-blooded animals, but more so the wild dogs. I mean, feral dogs. So when dogs get into packs and then they become fearless and they start attacking anybody, including humans, and they become aggressive, and that can lead to the spread of rabies, which is a very big issue in India. So 96% cases of rabies in India are caused by bites from feral dogs. So that's another threat that comes from feral dogs.
So I think the topic of rabies is very pertinent because we're still in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. COVID-19 pandemic also brought in the shocking realities of the illegal wildlife trade. So from the last few years, what are some key lessons we can take away from COVID-19 pertaining to zoonotic diseases?
So I think, see, for the scientists, actually, most scientists have been predicting a pandemic like the COVID-19 since 2004, as early as that. Okay, but people didn't want to listen because it's very inconvenient, right? They don't want to inconvenience their lives. Governments were prioritizing other things. They still are prioritizing other things. But to scientists, this was not a surprise. So really, there's nothing much in terms of zoonotic disease that we've learned, except the fact that there is an urgency now to deal with zoonotic diseases. In terms of the larger population, I think what COVID-19 has done is made us all aware of what zoonotic diseases are, because before that, most common people did not know what zoonotic diseases were, and that, diseases could get transferred between humans and animals, and especially from wild animals. So now most people know about that. And now governments have also realized that, this interface between wildlife and humans can lead to severe consequences for either side. Unfortunately, what has happened is public memory is very short. And once COVID-19, now that COVID, you can see how people have stopped wearing masks, nobody cares. Once the situation normalizes, people tend to forget what happened and they get back to life as normal. And that is one of the biggest challenges we've had. So while we have had a lot of interest in treatment and vaccinations and things like that, we still do not have much interest from governments and from people in surveillance and monitoring for zoonotic diseases, especially when it comes to zoonotic diseases which have an origin in wildlife. So, for example, in India, we still do not have a program that is going out and actively monitoring or surveying for these diseases in wildlife, and that's still very far away for us. So that is one of the lessons that I think we need to learn, is that we need to be more proactive in our surveillance methods for diseases, not just in wildlife, but also livestock and humans. We need to work together in terms of the human health, wildlife health, and livestock health sectors. And we need to take a more ecosystem approach rather than a individual departmental approach to handling health and well-being issues in the three groups. So that's literally what One Health talks about. Although One Health encompasses a much larger scope of areas under health and well-being, and One Health still is very much focused more on human health and well-being. So I think that needs to change. It has to be more about, I would say, planetary health or ecosystem health, because it should lay equal emphasis on the health of animals, because that's where things are preventable. We cannot, it's very difficult to control human behavior, as we have seen in the COVID pandemic. Whereas with animals, and especially with livestock, it is much easier to identify, to prevent, and to control diseases. So I think that's where we should be putting most of our attention. And then, of course, once we take care of livestock, uh, a lot of the wildlife interface also gets taken care of. The other thing is, of course, protecting our biodiversity, protecting our forests, and making sure that we do not encroach upon wild areas anymore. We don't encroach upon wildlife habitats anymore, because the minute we do that, the wildlife have no other place except to come out into human dominated areas, and that's where the interface between humans and wildlife increases. And then that's the area where spillover of disease occurs, right? So if we avoid that interface, then we also avoid the spillover. So I always like to think of wildlife and forests, of the natural habitats, as a kind of, what do you say, a kind of a sink for all of the diseases, the zoonotic disease, and and it's kind of like a Pandora's box that has held everything bad within it. And the moment we go and interfere with these natural areas, we are opening that Pandora's box and allowing all of these diseases to come out and affect us.
So, one more zoonotic disease which is prevalent currently is the monkeypox disease. So, what exactly is this disease and where does it originate from?
So monkeypox disease is actually a disease caused by a virus which is very similar to smallpox, and it actually originated from Africa and spread from monkeys to humans. And for a long time, it was just confined to certain pockets of Africa where monkeys and humans were in close contact. But because of the increase in travel and people moving to different parts of the world, this disease has now started to spread across the world. And it first started to spread to the US, to Europe, to the Western countries, and from there it has come into Asia and other parts of the world. And so mainly it is spread through, initially in the initial times, it was spread from contact between monkeys and humans. But nowadays it can be spread from humans to humans through close contact, and by sharing objects that a person with monkeypox has used, like if they've touched something, or if they've used a clothing, towel, and things like that. So, and it is also sexually transmissible. So that's another way that it can be spread. So yes.
So, what are some other zoonotic diseases which you think might become problematic in the future, or are already a matter of concern?
Correct. So thing is, like, there is a lot of noise around many of these diseases, like the coronaviruses, monkeypox, influenza. The problem is that most of these viral diseases they occur as epidemics. Okay, they'll come and then they go. And many of them are actually vaccine treatable also. Viruses are very fragile organisms, as you might know. And so many of these diseases are easily preventable by, say, simple things like washing hands, disinfection, wearing a mask, things like that. The more dangerous zoonotic diseases are the bacterial ones and the fungal ones, because these diseases, these organisms, bacteria and fungi, are very resistant to many of our preventive measures, including what we do for viruses. So those diseases, I think, are the ones that we really need to be worried about. These have been around for a long time. Diseases like anthrax, diseases like tuberculosis, and there are many other zoonotic diseases that are important in different parts of the world, leptospirosis. So these diseases cause immense amount of illness and death every year across the globe. and we just do not pay enough attention to them because they're not, sensational. They don't come as epidemics and create a havoc and then go and disappear, but they've always been around for centuries. Now, anthrax is one of the oldest diseases known to man, and it is a zoonotic, completely zoonotic disease. So, we've just got used to this and we don't pay attention. But these are the diseases that cause one of the most amount of damage and continue to do so. And so those, I think, are what we really need to be worried about. Of course, we also need to look at viral diseases. And like I said, many of the viral diseases occur because we've suddenly, encroached into wildlife areas, or we're having more interface with wildlife, human interface with wildlife, or even livestock interface with wildlife. So avoiding those will help us avoid a lot of the viral diseases that are now encroaching.
So you mentioned the tuberculosis. So recently there's been a lot of noise about how captive elephants can transfer tuberculosis to their mahouts. There have been a few studies in, so I think Thailand and even Ajmer Fort. So could you just explain the role of the illegal wildlife trade and captive animals in the spread of zoonotic diseases?
So that's absolutely wrong. Captive elephants do not pass on tuberculosis to their mahouts. It's the other way around. It's called reverse zoonosis. And tuberculosis in captive elephants is one of the best examples of reverse zoonosis. So elephants did not have tuberculosis, especially tuberculosis caused by Mycobacterium tuberculosis. And also Mycobacterium bovis. Both of these organisms were not typically found in elephants, and they have come in either from livestock or through humans. For captive elephants, this has come in through mahouts. A lot of mahouts, live in poverty and under conditions which are not conducive for health, and many of them suffer from tuberculosis. And so when they go in close proximity to the elephants, they have passed on this disease to the elephants. So a lot of captive elephants now across the globe have been affected by tuberculosis, including in India. And so this is a very good example of how humans have affected wildlife. It's not just from wildlife to humans, but also from humans to wildlife that zoonotic diseases can be transferred. And another good example is that recently scientists found, there are these bacteria which are called drug-resistant bacteria because they're resistant to many of the antibiotics that we use now. And scientists have recently found these drug-resistant bacteria in penguins in the end. And the only way this could have reached them is through humans or through our wastes reaching the penguins. So that's another potential reverse zoonosis that we are seeing. And there are many other cases like this. So all in all, like I said, whichever way the zoonosis is being transmitted, the point is that we need to make sure that wildlife areas are sacrosanct, that we do not encroach upon them, that we do not, harm wildlife populations, that we do not try to encroach into their habitats or destroy their habitats in any way, forcing them to come out into human dominated areas. And we definitely need to be more mindful of how we live and where we live. Our populations are expanding every day, and there is only so much space that we have for everybody. So we have to be mindful of our population, of the way we use, consume. Of course, wildlife, illegal trade and poaching of wildlife is a very big issue. But in reality, that is a very small fraction of interface from where zoonotic diseases come in. Nipah is a very good example. There is no wildlife trade involved in Nipah virus transmission or in avian influenza or H5N1 influenza transmission. But it happens just because wildlife have been forced to move into areas where humans and their livestock live. And from there, it has jumped into humans, right? So main thing is to make sure that we do not impact wildlife and their habitats anymore.
That is a very interesting point. So my final question for you, what would your advice be for people who want to enter the wildlife health field?
My advice would be, please do take this work up. There are very few people out there who are actually looking at wildlife disease Most people in India who are working on wildlife health are either looking at wildlife medicine, which involves treating and working with injured wildlife, which is great. But we also need people to actively work on how diseases affect wildlife populations, how diseases impact wildlife, because each species of animal is different and each pathogen behaves very differently in different species. So we have a lot of information on diseases from humans and livestock, but we do not know how these diseases affect wildlife, right? So I'll give you a very good example. During my PhD, I was working on pneumonia in bighorn sheep, which are these wild sheep that are found in the US. And what we found was that these wild sheep were never exposed to the bacteria that were causing pneumonia in them. These bacteria came into the wild sheep from contact with domestic sheep. And the same bacteria do not cause any harm in the domestic sheep at all. But the minute they move into wild sheep, they cause instant death. Like it's 100% fatal almost. So, that's the kind of change that the same pathogens can have between different species. And these are still belonging to the same genera, Ovis genera, but different species, right? So we need people to look into this to understand how disease affects different wildlife and how it might impact populations of this wildlife. And that how in turn that would affect health of the community as a whole that's living in that region. So I would advise youngsters to definitely go ahead with this. And if anybody is interested, they can reach out to me and for help on how to go about pursuing a career in this field. And please do go ahead and welcome to approach me for that.
Thanks. Thank you so much for your time. It's nice listening to you.
Yeah, thank you, Anish. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.